This is the Lean Construction Blogs Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories, case studies, and lessons learned of applying lean construction from around the world. Join Dick Beyer as he interviews industry leaders, lean construction practitioners, and subject matter experts to help you improve the build environment in general and your design and construction projects in particular, advance your lean journey, and bring your continuous improvement efforts to the next level. Let's get started.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good day, wherever you may be in the world. I'm Dick Beyer with the Lean Construction Blog, and today we are really happy to welcome to the podcast a guy who has been instrumental in getting us to understand things that we're curious about and that we don't necessarily understand. And I'll let Dan speak about that more. But without further ado, let me introduce Daniel Howard Pink. Just such a great man.
Hey, thank you, Dick, and thank you for mentioning my rarely mentioned middle name.
Well, I have a son named Henry Elliott Beyer, and it always seems so romantic and rolling out. I thought the same thing. Okay, so welcome, Dan. Thank you so much again for taking the time to hang with us. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background, kind of what you do for those people not familiar with it, and how you got to do that, where you went to school or got your education, and your general motivation for doing all the stuff that you do.
Yeah, so I grew up in the American Midwest. I grew up in Central Ohio. I went to college, and I majored in linguistics, kind of a hardcore mathematical social science.
Wow.
Because I was a middle-class kid from the middle of America, I was definitely not going to move any further along in the world of linguistics, and instead did what people like me do, which is they do something practical, like go to law school, and that's what I did. At the time, I was keenly interested in politics, so it made some sense. I didn't really love law school. I went in there not knowing really what lawyers actually did, and so once I discovered that, I said, "Whoa, I'm not sure I can do that." And so graduated law school. I started working in politics because, as I said, that was something I was keenly interested in, and in a kind of half-assed way became a speech writer, because I was a decent writer and a fast typist. And at one point, somebody turned to me to write a speech, and I did it. And then they turned to me again, and suddenly that was my job. And I did that for a while, and then I decided that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in politics. And that I was actually more of a writer than I realized. Writing was always something that I did as kind of a hobby, something I did on the side, but I realized it was kind of who I am. And so in my early 30s, I left that job. My wife kept her job, kept her health insurance, our health insurance, and I went on my own to write about what interested me, and write about stuff that I was curious about, and under my own byline, and to see if I could hack out a living doing it. And so in that time, I've written 7 books on a whole range of different subjects, really what I found intriguing, everything from the rise of people working for themselves, to some of the new skills that are necessary in the labor market, to the science of motivation, to some of the dynamics and even the science of persuasion and influence, to the secrets of timing, to the emotion of regret. And that's what I've been doing for the last 2+ decades.
Fantastic. Well, our particular focus with your work is every one of your books. So you started off writing about some interesting things. I think your 3rd book was about the right-brained people need to step up and take over the world, which hit me directly because I've been a fan of Ian McGilchrist for a long time, and have been and he's not a guy who writes a short book. It takes him like 11,000 pages to cover what you cover. But my industry, or the people that I hang out with, are largely engineers and very binary, 1-2 people. They would belong into the class of fast thinkers, into the Kahneman and Tversky idea. They develop heuristics pretty quickly. And that's how they do things. And the construction industry is loaded with not only that, but the representations and artifacts of that kind of thinking, which are automated scheduling and automated estimating, that actually don't work very well. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you found when you got into that, what interested you about that. And
Well, I mean, I didn't write about the construction industry per se, but what I wrote about was some changes that were happening in the economy writ large and labor markets writ large. And the theory of the case in that book is that there's certain kinds of abilities that used to get you into the middle class, logical, linear, call them like spreadsheet SAT abilities, that those abilities, while they're still necessary, absolutely, they're not sufficient because a lot of those abilities, and I wrote this book, a decade and a half ago, a lot of those abilities are somewhat easy to offshore, but also increasingly easy to automate. And as a consequence, people will need to do things that are harder to outsource and harder to automate. And those tend to be things that are characteristic of the right hemisphere of the brain, not lodged there, as a matter of scientific fact, but sort of metaphorically right brain. So things like artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big picture thinking, symphonic thinking, team building, understanding where people are coming from, having a sense of purpose, those kinds of things. And so that book laid out that argument and some of the abilities that I thought were going to be necessary. I think one of the interesting things about that book is, in a world now of AI, how many of the right brain-ish abilities, say writing a sonnet or writing a piece of music or brainstorming ideas, can be done now with software or with large language models.
I'm really the thing that brings to mind to me is, so what is the richness that is lost from, from the translation of a CD to an actual symphonic performance? There's a substantial difference in the feeling and the character and what you
Sure.
hear. And how much of that is lost in an AI world that we're writing sonnets in accordance with a,
I don't, you know what? I don't know. My own view is that it's largely a good thing. I mean, because in the same way that CDs or even streaming music is largely a good thing. It's not a perfect thing for everybody in the ecosystem, but it's largely a good thing. In the old days, only certain people, a very, very rarefied group of people, could go hear a symphony. And with radio and then CDs and now streaming, that music is accessible to a much wider range of people. It's not the same experience, but it is more small d democratic, and I think that's largely a good thing. What some of the early work on AI has shown is that AI is powerful in lifting people up from the bottom. So if you look at, say, the distribution of writers, of writing talent, let's call it that way, the people in the top, whatever, call it top 20%, they're fine. They're not going to, AI can be a supplement to them. It's not much of a threat to them. It's the people really in the lower percentiles, all the way up probably to about the 60th percentile, who are going to be helped considerably. And it's the people really basically between the 60th and 80th percentile who are probably going to get clobbered by this. That is large group of people going to be brought up, but people whose jobs were just doing ordinary copywriting, ordinary memo writing, internal communications, that kind of stuff, they might be in big trouble because of these large language models.
That's interesting. And that is a substitute for certainly what you said about CDs making music more accessible to people who wouldn't normally have it in radios and all the rest of that. So how does that change the labor market for, especially people like those in our community who put on a heavy jacket when it's 35 below and they go and lift rebar and carry it across a raft in the middle of a snowstorm?
Yeah. I don't know. What we've often seen throughout the history of labor is that you have technologies of all sorts, whether rudimentary machines to AI, that end up doing some of the work that human beings once did, and often doing it just as well. Now, I think what's interesting here, if history is our guide, is that at every one of these junctures, there have been sort of alarm that it's the end of work, it's the end of labor, that there aren't going to be any jobs for anybody anymore. And at every moment, that prediction has been wrong. And I think a reason for that is that there's a certain poverty of imagination in the present. So for instance, I know I grew up in Ohio, as I mentioned, I grew up in Ohio, and I grew up during the time that the Rust Belt was rusting. And so I was at the kind of the pivot point where it became pretty clear that one wasn't going to be able to graduate from high school and go to work in a factory. Those days were ending, and that you were better off going to college and becoming a knowledge worker. And even at that time, you had people saying this is nonsense. We can't have a service economy. We can't have a knowledge economy. Not everybody is equipped to do that. And besides, economies are about making things and not about manipulating information. And that turned out to be flatly wrong. What we did is we got really, 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 really good at making things, so we can make more things with fewer people. And there was some dislocation, some serious dislocation that I think, in my view, our governments didn't do a good enough job of addressing. But it didn't collapse the economy. It didn't lead to the end of jobs, because in that moment there was a poverty of imagination. Nobody at that time imagined that people would have jobs as social media consultants or search engine optimizers or massage therapists or life coaches or cryptocurrency traders or whatever. And I think that's probably going to be the case here, that AI is going to displace a number of people in a number of functions, but ultimately, when we reconvene for this interview in 20 years or 40 years, they're going to be a set of jobs, a set of tasks, a set of jobs, especially a set of job titles that might not even make sense to us today.
It's a poignant point, and I think, while we do have people out there doing, I guess construction is probably, factory work and construction are probably the greatest examples of still hands-on, very manual labor, people, driving their trucks to work and picking stuff up and putting it together. But there is a movement towards industrial construction and prefabrication and all of that stuff that will change the way that people look at things. When Henry Ford invented the assembly line, to the extent that he invented it, he had master laborers on that assembly line, because he didn't have people who knew how automobiles went together. He still needed to have people who understood how automobiles went together. So that's interesting. Let's get to the next book in line, for at least for our community, which has been Drive, and that has been really a signal resource for owners of large construction programs, people in the public sector, around how they motivate teams and other people, because largely the contracts that have been written, and being a law school graduate yourself as I am, we have tried to use those contracts to control behavior or punish people for not engaging in the right behavior, as well as trying to sell risk that's a very difficult. It's not an efficient way of managing risk. Trying to sell it to somebody and then hoping it just goes away. Right. So I'm wondering how the concepts of Drive and the motivation and the incentives. I mean, the one thing that I've learned from Drive was, especially either as a manager or as a person in the industry, you have to take money off the table, because money very rarely helps you drive people to good behavior. It often drives people, especially in construction, to bad behavior. So tell us a little bit about how you not stumbled on that, but why that was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I did stumble on it. I did stumble on it in a way. I mean, not to be, just to be fair. I mean, I got to it by some readers asking questions. So I made this argument that right brain skills are going to become more central to what people do for a living. Again, big picture thinking, team building, empathy, design, storytelling. And so somebody asked me the question, well, how do you motivate people to do that kind of work? We think we know how to motivate traditional knowledge workers. How do you motivate these people who are doing more conceptual, creative, high concept and high touch work? And I had no idea. And so I started looking a little bit at the literature on motivation, and it shocked me. I mean, it was staring me in the face that there was evidence that a lot of our instincts, a lot of our intuitions about what motivated people were flatly wrong. And so I started digging into that research and realized that it needed a wider audience. And let me give you the punchline here, because there's some nuance to this, because it's not money isn't really the main thing. And I want to get to that in a moment, because I think it gives us some clues about humanity itself. So we have now 50, 60 years of evidence in social psychology, even in some economics, about how certain kinds of motivators work. And there's a kind of a central motivator that we use in organizations. Psychologists call it a controlling contingent motivator. I like to call it an if-then reward, as in, if you do this, then you get that. If you do this, then you get that. The then could be money, it could be promotion, it could be accolades, it could be whatever, but it's really if you do this, then you get that. Over a half century of research tells us that if-then rewards are actually pretty effective for simple tasks with short time horizons. They work pretty well. And the reason for that is that human beings love reward. So if you dangle a reward in front of somebody, you'll get their attention. You'll get their attention in a very focused way. That's actually helpful if you know exactly what you need to do and you don't have to do it for very long. Works pretty well. However, the same body of research tells us that these if-then rewards are far, 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 far less effective for complex tasks with longer time horizons, because those kinds of if-then rewards don't give you the motivational energy to sustain your effort for a long time. What's more, especially for creative work, certain kinds of conceptual work, even in construction, sort of on the spot problem solving and figuring things out, that you don't want to look at a problem narrowly. That's what contingent rewards do. You want to look at it expansively. And so what this research tells us is that for a large clutch of jobs, the better way to motivate people is to pay them well, pay them fairly. But as you said before, at some level, take the issue of money off the table. Pay people enough so that they're focused on the work rather than on the money. Once you do that, what you need with different degrees in different industries and different functions and so forth is a sense of autonomy. That is, do people have some control over what they do, how they do it, when they do it, where they do it? A sense of mastery. Are they getting better at something that matters? Are they making progress in meaningful work? And a sense of purpose. And those things tend to lead to enduring. Enduring motivation. And in construction, it's there's also some nuance, because you don't want every single person on a construction site to be 100% fully autonomous and do whatever he or she feels like. There have to be some systems, there have to be some processes and things like that. The same thing is true in medicine, but it's true that certain kinds of checklisted environments depend heavily on autonomy in other ways.
I've thought that paradigm has actually had resonance in construction, because I think a third part of that was also that you could look back at your work and go, wow, I actually accomplished something. And if you're hanging 150 square feet of drywall in a day, and you have the autonomy to figure out how you're going to do it so that you're best positioned to do it, and you've gotten really good at doing it, then you look back at the end of the day and you go, wow, that was a great day. I can go home and I can look forward to tomorrow, where I'm going to have an immediate kind of intrinsic benefit to myself. That yes, it's a 50-yard dash. I went out and I did a 50-yard dash and I won the prize. I think the difficulty is, and the example I use is, if I told somebody inside the company, if you save us $1 million this year, we'll give you $100,000. And then they would call up somebody like me and they would try to do some lean stuff, and they would, put paper clips in a drawer someplace that was colored, and they would do that, and they'd save, by July they would have saved $60,000. And in November they just fire 8 people and boom, that takes them there. And that's just,
you want to say exactly, you want to save money, fire a bunch of people, use cheaper materials.
exactly.
And so it's exactly what you're saying. And so one of the dangers of those kinds of contingent rewards is that people become so enamored of the reward, they get there any way possible. And it diverges from the purpose, it diverges from ethics. Sometimes, not all the time, sometimes, but I think you make a really profound point, Dick, about that drywall example. And there's some other really, really good evidence of this. One of the most important pieces of research in talent in the last 20 years was some work done by Teresa Mobile at Harvard Business School. And what you found in surveying, in basically chronicling the day-to-day lives of, or not chronicling, but capturing the day-to-day motivations of something like 12,000 workers, is that the single biggest motivator day to day is making progress and meaningful work. And one of the things about construction, in contrast to other kinds of, certain kinds of white collar work, is that you see the progress you're making.
Right.
You know, you're building a wall and the wall gets bigger. You're putting up a piece of drywall and now suddenly there's something that you can see, something tangible that wasn't there yesterday. And that's a huge source of satisfaction for people. And there are certain kinds of professions and certain kinds of jobs that lend themselves more readily to that. But that sense of making progress and seeing the fruits of your labor is extraordinarily important in keeping and maintaining motivation.
Progress principle is a really important piece of what we
Yeah.
try to do, and it is the different kinds of motivation we had. Getting back to drywallers, I was working on the Children's Hospital at the University of Iowa, and the drywallers had just been the drywall company had just been purchased by a big national firm, and there was a complete lack of motivation. People didn't know what was happening, so the drywallers weren't doing a very good job. So we put them all on a bus and we took them to Des Moines, and we took them to the neonatal intensive care unit. And all of a sudden, productivity for the next 3 months of the drywallers just skyrocketed because they had a sense of purpose. They knew why
exactly
they were doing what they
yeah,
were.
I mean, exactly. I mean, there's so many good examples of this. That's another. I mean, that's so the progress. You know, the making progress is a huge motivator. But exactly as you say, seeing why you're doing something is powerful too. And in fact, for all the managers out there, I mean, explain to people why what folks are doing matters, why it contributes, why it affects the world is, by my read of the research, the single most cost-effective performance enhancer we have, because it doesn't cost anything. I mean, I guess a bus ride to Des Moines costs you a little bit, but beyond that, it doesn't really cost you very much. And there's a whole array of other kinds of academic research showing this. So you look at people raising funds for nonprofits. If they meet with the people who were on the receiving end of the money that was raised, their performance goes up. Even small things like lifeguards who read stories about lifeguards saving people are more likely to re-up the next season as a lifeguard. There's a fabulous study out of Harvard Business School, and I'm spacing out on who did it, that shows that when cooks in the back of a restaurant, back of a cafeteria, not a fancy restaurant, were able to see the customers who were eating their food, the quality of their food improved. And so there's some really, really powerful evidence that there's this, that first you talk about mastery, that you also talk about purpose, that those are really powerful, potent motivators. And in a sense, I always think of them a little bit like solar energy, and that it's relatively easy to replenish, whereas these contingent motivators are more like fossil fuel or coal. You just have to keep shoveling more coal into the furnace to keep it fired up. And I think that the principles apply to a whole range of industries, including construction.
Which is one of the I just had a message pop up that apparently when I came back to work, they didn't renew my total Zoom license. So we might die in 10 minutes, and then I'll have to dial you right back.
Okay, that's fine.
That's okay. So just as a heads up. So specifically with respect to construction and the role of contractors and designers and the rest of that, the integration of work spheres, the de-siloization, if that's a word that we could use, to get people together. How do you bring those disciplines together when especially in our business, designers are folks with berets and capes, and they go sit on a rock someplace and they come up with the big design, and then they try to orchestrate some construction that is driven by a guy who's 9'10" and 600 pounds and is just hell bent for the John Henry or the the steam shovel Bob story, or any of those things. How do you what's some good advice to our folks about how you bring those people together to a more common purpose?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things is that you bring that common purpose to the surface, and you talk, you spend, the people who are running these projects spend a lot of time spend more time talking about why people are doing something, rather than merely how they should be doing it. So I think having conversations about why we're all doing this is important, and using similar language with people who seem, at least superficially, to be disparate. I also think there is something to be said for bringing people together physically across different perspectives and different disciplines. There's deep, I don't want to sound like a Hallmark card, but deep down, people are very similar to each other. They really are. And you sometimes see that when you sit and have lunch with somebody who you wouldn't have lunch with before. There's physical proximity and familiarity go a very, very, very long way. What's more is another thing that I also like is asking for advice across disciplines. So you have a designer, let's say, asking somebody on the front lines, what's your advice for this design? Like, do you think it's going to work, et cetera, et cetera? And then vice versa, having the construction person ask the designer, saying, hey, you know what, this is how I'm going to go about executing this project. What's your advice on that? So physical proximity, advice giving, and the person who is the project manager really talking a lot about the whys. I think that goes a long way.
Yeah. So
that goes a long way. I think that some of it is I think some of it is the presumption across these different tribes that the other tribe is profoundly different from them, when they're not. The person in the beret and the person in the hard hat have a lot more in common than we think.
I think it's absolutely true. And part of what we have tried to do is we have a concept called the big room, where we hire the designers and the contractors and the trades all at the same time, and we integrate in the big room so that they sit together and they physically talk about this stuff. Another thing we do is, as a lawyer, you might find this interesting. Designers who participate in means and methods are always subject to liability if they make the wrong call. And yet, what designer wouldn't think about how a building was going to be built when they design it? And so these artificial prohibitions keep people from doing it, which brings up another thing. And I don't think you've written a book specifically on this, but people get afraid to do what we're asking them to do. People get afraid to share stories about the purpose of the project because they've never done it before. It's a very opaque business, and the contracts are very closed. And how I go and do my business, you'll never know. So how do we overcome that that fear it's almost institutionalized in our contracts, but it's certainly there, where people don't want to have that conversation with people that work for them, tell them, what's really happening. It's like, well, we have to have a meeting to figure out how we're going to tell them, this piece of news, and that just seems so crazy to me.
Yeah, I think it's generally inertia that explains a lot of that. Like, this is how it's always been done. This is how my boss did it, so this is how I'm going to do it. I think it's a big error. In general, within limits, I'm a fan of transparency, not because in general in organizations, not because I'm necessarily a noble person, but when there isn't transparency, people still talk. In fact, and so what inevitably happens is, especially when in a hierarchical situation, there'll be the bosses will be opaque. And it's not as if the great unwashed workers say, oh, it doesn't really matter, I'm not thinking about this. They're wondering what's going on behind those closed curtains. And my experience has been that what's going on behind those closed curtains is almost always way less nefarious than what people are thinking. So just open the curtains, you know what I mean? Open the curtains. What you have behind the curtains are, like all of us, flawed people making tough decisions with imperfect information and trying to do their best. And so in general, I like transparency only because it mitigates the cost of useless gossip and people surmising what's going on, which is a tax on productivity.
And very corrosive to, some concept of trust that you're trying to do.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I think it can erode trust, and it can create a kind of a us and them environment rather than a we environment. Again, I don't want to sound like a Hallmark card, but I think that's right. In situations, in large enterprises where there are clear hierarchies, and in construction, there are going to be hierarchies based on pay. There are going to be hierarchies based on education level. There's a tendency to devolve into us and them, or even worse, us versus them, and that's unhealthy. And now there are ways around that. In some of the literature on teams, there's a concept of simple beacons, which is not like a mission statement, but is a kind of organic language that people are using to describe the project. The classic example of this is, and there's a famous paper in organizational leadership about this. It has to do with NASA in the 1960s, where even the simple beacon of send a man to the moon. Okay, so send a man to the moon. 6 words, all one syllable. There's no consultant coming in and doing a mission statement, mission, vision, and values, or anything like that. It's a very clear, simple beacon about what we're trying to accomplish. And from the highest, administrators to the engineers to the people sweeping the floors, they knew what they were doing. And so, those kinds of simple, managers who look for those simple beacons and who repeat those simple beacons and who amplify those simple beacons can be quite effective.
Our last discussion leads me to a question about trust. There are, several aphorisms bandied about, especially team building and the rest of that. The trust is essential. Trust is the key. You have to build trust. Trust is easy to build and it's easy to lose and hard to build, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of books written about it, including The Speed of Trust, which I don't like it very much. I'm more of a fan of, I don't know if you've read Robert Solomon and Fernando Flores' book called Building Trust, which is about.
I don't know that one. Yeah, I'll look at it. I'll look for it.
One that you make it's where they say they go through all the different paradigms of trust, and they say in order to get authentic trust, you just have to make an election that you're going to trust people, and you just have to decide that even when they violate that trust, you continue to invest in them until you can no longer invest in them. And so one of the things we talked about is eroding trust with behind the scenes, non-transparent bunch of of opacity, where you can't see through to things. Do you ever do consulting with clients where they say, "Oh, how should we change our organization so that we can be more, whatever," or is it mostly just?
I'm mostly a writer. I don't do a lot of that. I've done a little consulting, and I discovered 2 very important things about that. Number 1, I wasn't very good at it, and number 2, I didn't like it. I'm sure those 2 things were related.
So other than that, though,
yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good, because I think that your books stand alone as kind of what's great about, I think, your books, without being too much of a pinkophile here or whatever, is that they're very standalone in the sense that they give you that you focus on a topic and you cover the topic, and then you can apply that to the situations where that applies. It's not like a self-help book in the sense that, this is how you're going to turn your life around. You have to do these 19 things and the rest of that. So I'm interested in what's on your plate for the next book that you're working on. You're working on something on AI, or are you moving into?
I'm not. I'm not. I don't know what the next book is, so I'm actually experimenting with a few new things. So I started writing a column for the Washington Post called "Why Not," where we take ideas that are a little bit outside of the normal set of solutions and explore whether they're a good idea or not. So
I've seen
So
things. I've seen that. Like, why don't why don't the fans own Major League Baseball team?
yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that's
I love that
so
one.
yeah, no, I like it. I especially here in Washington, I want the family that owns the Washington Nationals to sell the team to the fans, and you know, there's precedent for that. You know, and so what we're trying to do here is, in a world where everyone is screaming at each other, is develop a kind of journalism that is less about arguing over who's right and who's wrong, and more talking about like what's possible. And so I actually just did a live chat with readers around the world. People have some really interesting ideas. I mean, national service ends up being really popular. Even national service for people who are over age 50 or 60. That ends up being really popular. There's a lot of concern about that we're not investing enough in kids and in childcare. Although some people have proposed giving kids the vote and parents exercise that by proxy. It's a controversial idea. In the world of transparency, one idea that I was playing around with is that we make everybody's federal income tax payments public, so that, you know, I could look up how much you paid in federal income tax. You could look up how much I paid in federal income tax. And so there are a lot. And so the idea here is just to, you know, spark a conversation. And so a lot more openness, a lot less cynicism, a lot more curiosity, and a lot less, you know, conviction that somebody's right and somebody's wrong.
Well, that's certainly the conversation I would love to have, because I end up saying 20 times a week, well, why can't we do that? You know,
Exactly.
we have a scheduling process where the trades actually do the schedule, because they're the ones that do the work.
Mm-hmm.
And they get together and they talk about how they're going to flow across a project and where their crews are going to go and when work is going to be released. And that's so much more effective. I mean, almost 20% more effective by the evidence than some kid who just got out of college writing up a computer schedule in a closet someplace. She's got no idea how buildings come together. And somehow we got into that, you know, and it's like we get into these things that we don't know. I love the idea that you should know what I pay in taxes and I can know what you pay in taxes. Because that really does open up the idea of a much more transparent and democratic space.
Yeah, and that idea. I mean, I'm not, you know, there's some big downsides to that idea, but there are countries that already do this. A few Scandinavian countries do this, and we do it in the States with property taxes. So you could look up right now, or anybody listening to this right now could look up, you know, what I paid in property taxes in the District of Columbia. But anyway, the point of that endeavor is to try to chart some new territory where we're not screaming at each other, where we're looking expansively, not narrowly, and we're willing to have a conversation, and we're willing to deal with a degree of uncertainty about what, you know, whether something is going to work. One of the things that frustrated me, this is a long-standing frustration. We talked a little bit about law school. One of my core frustrations about law school is that if there's an idea, especially for lawyers, if there's an idea that is a little bit wobbly, that's not fully formed, lawyers are very good at knocking it down, finding the weaknesses and knocking it down. And that's an important skill to have. But I also think there's something to be said. I know there's something to be said, and maybe it's my natural inclination to take something that is a little bit wobbly and not fully formed and say, okay, how can we make it better? How can we strengthen this? How can we get it to stand up? What are the virtues of this? What can we change? How can we actually make this? How can we make this work? It's a difference between, and here we go, bringing it back to this topic. It's a difference. Lawyers are very good at deconstruction. They're less good at construction.
Because they're rarely paid for that, and when they are paid for that, they're writing contracts, and they're writing contracts that protect that visibly protect their clients, so their clients won't get mad at them that they're not protecting them. Right?
Exactly,
When that's not
exactly.
exactly what a contract should be.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, I haven't thought much about that, and nor have I written about it. But I think this idea of what contracts are is kind of fascinating. When we do contracts for our business here, we have a certain way of writing contracts. It basically goes like this. You know, we basically have a list. I will, then a list. You will, and then a list. And that's the bulk of the contract. There aren't 47 contingencies. There aren't, you know, pages and pages of arbitration and thick language and so forth. We're basically saying, I'm doing business with you because you're the kind of person I want to do business. Let's memorialize what our obligations are to each other, and let's assume that each of us is going to keep their end of the bargain.
You'd be interested that Ian McNeill and his relational contract replaced offer and acceptance and consideration with exchange and reciprocity as the way that contracts really should come forward, which is, terrific.
Yeah. And what you also see is, again, I mean, I think we had a property law professor, Bob Ellickson, who was sort of a proponent of law and economics, but he also, you think about like landlord tenant law, something like that. I mean, ultimately what happens is that you have a lease and then something goes awry, people work it out. And the lease, might give some of the contours of it, but ultimately people work it out. They figure out, they figure out a solution. And so, and what I don't, and I see, you often start a project, especially in media, with a bad taste in your mouth because, there'll be terms like, for me as a creator or as a, performer, whatever, it's like, every word you utter belongs to us in every language, including those languages not yet invented, from here and after in every medium, including those that have not been invented yet, in every universe, including those that have not been discovered yet, and, and it seems like there's some friction that the attempt to actually be value enhancing, they're actually corroding value because it's gumming up the gears of commerce.
And
But this is
when
an
you
interesting
start,
issue. I don't know very much about it. It makes me want to actually explore it more.
it's really funny because when you start with a bad taste in your mouth, you're starting a relationship off on exactly the wrong foot.
Right.
I think that's why people are reluctant to do prenuptials and stuff. It's kind of like, let's not talk about the money. I mean, and yet every divorce that I've ever seen is, they should have talked about the money. They should have talked about physical expectations. They should have talked about stuff ahead of time so that they knew what their kind of expectations going into this thing was, rather than having a Disneyland wedding where, they spend all the money that they've ever earned on a dress and a morning suit. But
No, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, marriage is a contract of sorts in a sort of broader sense, and I mean, my contract for licensing the Portuguese rights to one of my books is lengthier than any marriage contract I've ever seen.
well, it's funny because the lawyers get in there and they start to do this. So especially in our business, where I mean, people are called contractors for God's sakes. So and in Canada, they love their contracts up here. They when the COVID came in, they went around the world and they got contracts for vaccines and everything, and they're going, we're all set, we're ready to go because we've got contracts. And then when Belgium had COVID, and they said, well, no, we're manufacturing vaccines in Belgium, we're going to keep them here. And it was like, what? I mean, that violates our contract. Yeah, well, sue us or bring a tank over, do whatever you're going to do. We don't care.
Right.
So they're supposed to be enabling rather than disabling. So I think there's a good story there. I'd be happy to help you with with that.
Yeah,
story.
no, I think that there is a good story. I mean, I think that there's an incredible amount. I think they introduce an incredible amount of friction to commerce. When what they're trying to do is they're trying to make commerce work better. I think they're introducing a lot of friction, and then once again, there's a lot of inertia there. But when I look at contracts, particularly in media, a lot of the contracts read as basically the media lawyer full employment act. They're looking for ways to justify their own jobs.
They're expensive. I mean, so I'm surprised that you didn't like law school that much. I loved law school because I was a history major and I actually studied American history under Bruce Catton's son at Middlebury College, and so I was full of stories, wonderful things. And I thought the English common law system, which is really just a bunch of stories put together,
Right.
People can kind of read the book and see where they go. I loved that whole thing, and that was really easy for me because I was good. I was used to stories and fairy tales and things like that. And the woman who caught her foot in the bus in Los Angeles was, a knock knock joke. But anyway, off to the other piece of what I was really hoping to get your insight on. And we've talked about team building and kind of those kinds of things, but at some level, some organic level, putting people together who are used to not being together for a 3 or 4 year period to go build a building is a very difficult thing.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you have any insight on how you take like fractious um, silos and try to get them moving towards a single goal.
I mean, I don't know. I don't have any magic elixirs beyond what we talked about before. One of them is making sure that everybody understands the purpose, and that recognizing that that person across from them who looks different actually shares that purpose. There's some other research showing that, as simple-minded as it might sound, that people eating together is actually is a surprisingly effective team building skill. So having a retreat and doing trust falls and things like that, whatever, but actually having people eat together can be really powerful. It's one reason why I don't love like executive dining rooms or that kind of thing. So having people eat together, and as I mentioned before, I like the idea of both giving and seeking advice is a powerful solvent for building affinity, more than I realize. I'm a kind of convert on this. I didn't realize that until a few years ago, that when you ask for advice, you're building affinity. When you give advice, you're building affinity. And so advice giving across disciplines is, I think, another, something else that is quite effective.
As a keen observer of the world at large, do you have any recommendations or pet peeves about the built environment in general? What we should be doing that would be better, or
I mean, I don't, I mean, again, that's one of the many things on which I have, on which we have zero expertise. I mean, I think that one of the, I've seen some of the evidence on the importance of natural light in overall well-being. I think that is, and I see a lot of buildings that don't have much natural light. It seems like that could be a problem, that could go a long way in enhancing the value of the built environment. I do have a little bit of a pet peeve on the configuration of offices. So it's more sort of interior design rather than building design, but especially now post-COVID, post-pandemic, where you have essentially what seems to be kind of a permanent hybrid. The physical design of offices hasn't changed much, and it ought to. That is when people are able to do heads down work wherever they want, and even are able to communicate, as you and I are, across, two national capitals. You have to ask yourself, when people come together in physical space in an office, what does it look like? And I think it looks radically different from what we used to think of as offices, which are essentially places where people use machines, use knowledge machines to sit by themselves and do work. So I think there's a huge opportunity in really radically reconceiving what offices look like, based on their new purpose. And then beyond that, I don't think I have, I think that the built environment, again, this is been stated many times before. I don't think it's overstated, been mentioned before. I'm amazed at how much the built environment requires in many cases the use of automobiles. In the way, and I think that's deleterious to our well-being, whether it's pollution, global warming, or even the insane amount of time people spend commuting, which brings them down considerably. So, so those are a few of my pet peeves. So I guess natural light, over reliance on automobiles, and offices that look exactly the same as they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, before these technologies became widespread, before everybody had a supercomputer connected to the world in their pocket. Yet the
Right.
offices haven't changed in the way that they look.
It's funny, there's an architect in Washington, Bob Fox, who has done an awful lot of work on repositioning or reimagining office space. He's got a newsletter and things that go out. So there's help, but help is on the way.
I hope so. I hope so. I think it's that adoption has been much slower than I expected. And what you had, in the last year or so is you had, now that the pandemic, we hope, is fully in a rearview mirror, you had the CEOs of companies, especially in finance, demanding that their employees come back full time, and the employees saying, "Oh, I don't know about that."
Right.
They would have had a better case if what people were coming back to was designed in a way to help them do work better. But the idea of bringing people back to an office to sit in front of a computer and do work by themselves with headphones on seems nuts.
Our company actually just closed their office. Said, hey, we're going to get people, people are working at home. They're visiting clients. They're doing all that stuff. We don't really need to have an office, and it costs us a bunch of money. Um, the last thing really is, I think, resilience. And, this economy, the building of office buildings and the rest of that are now vacant and could be used for other things. Um, the renovation and the remake of those things requires essentially just plumbing, but it's not a resiliency that people have built into the buildings that are building. If it's no longer an office, it could be a hospital, it could be
Right.
a apartment, it could be something else. So that resilience factor, and there's that resilience is really pushback from people who have always done things the same old way. So I think your why not effort out there really pushes to that. Is there anything we should be doing about the lack of resilience that we require in the institutions that are,
I don't know. I mean, it's a great,
around us?
I think I think it's a great point. I mean, on the particular issue, it's something we're dealing with here in Washington, DC, where I have lived and worked for a few decades. What we see now in Washington, DC is that our downtown is empty. Our downtown has not bounced back, and it's really unclear about what's going to happen with that. And so I think it requires much more expansive imagination to think about what goes in those spaces that were once occupied by knowledge workers sitting in cubicles, when they're not doing that. And it's a massive challenge. I mean, I don't know enough about the industry, but I think from what I've read, it's hard to instantly take an office building and magically convert it to an apartment into an apartment.
It's
a
largely
massive.
a plumbing problem. There's not enough pipes and
Okay.
stuff, systems to
Yeah.
actually work. Everything else works just fine, but you just can't get all the plumbing that you need to get into those buildings, and they've been built so that you can't cut holes in the core and all the rest of that. So it's a tough
Yeah.
problem.
We also have a kind of an urban design and policy issue here in DC, where we have limits on the heights of buildings, pretty severe limits on the heights of buildings, which is one reason why newcomers to Washington will go down to downtown Washington. All the buildings are the same height, because they've all hit the maximum. And now our mayor is actually proposing lifting those limits on height in order to facilitate the refurbishing of these office buildings as apartments, because apparently there'll be, developers need them to be taller. But again, going back to the why not, this particular issue is one that benefits from expansive thinking. It benefits from having, as you were saying earlier, Dick, having people from different perspectives sit around a table and talk about it and assume goodwill on the part of other people, rather than have us screaming at each other. And so right now, I'm not that optimistic about what's going to happen to DC, because it's alarming. Going downtown, even on a Friday night, and seeing it essentially be desolate because no one has been there during the day and no one is sticking around. And so you have restaurants that are closing and bars that are closing and um,
That's a problem here too. It's funny that we don't seem to have much of a civic dialogue about that stuff. I mean, you went to Yale Law School. Bino Cook, wasn't it? He the guy that would convene those dialogues where he would get labor leaders, he'd get union guys, and he'd get owners, and he'd get factory workers, and he would convene these roundtables, these big dialogues where people would
yeah,
actually talk about stuff. We
yeah.
don't seem to do that much anymore.
No, and I think it's a great point, and I think that what is the modern day equivalent of that? We have very little in American society. We have somebody wrote a book about this 10 years ago called The Big Sort, and essentially what it said was that we're all have partly enabled by technology. We all have retreated into our own tribes. So the people in my 9-digit zip code think pretty much what I think. They agree with me pretty much on everything. And the people in a different zip code don't. And I don't see those people because I live in this neighborhood. I shop at those grocery stores. I read the same publications. I watch the same TV shows. And we've all retreated. We've all we've sorted ourselves by politics, to some extent by religion, very much by certain kinds of identities. And we don't have opportunities. We don't have opportunities to mix. So those kinds of things, I don't know exactly what it is, but even the very metaphor of a round table where everybody sits around, it's not hierarchical and talks and has to look somebody in the eye. I actually think, again, not to be overly optimistic, I actually think that those kinds of things are benefits, and that the more of those we have, the more some of this nasty tone, this vitriol that we've seen might.
God, it's so bad, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you basically have, you know, um, like I'm all for. I mean, maybe because I'm trained as a lawyer, like I'm okay on disagreement. But what you have now is you have not only do I disagree with you, but if I disagree with you, then that inherently makes you a bad person.
Right.
And
And I have the right to do violence upon you because you're such a bad person. And you go, well, it's crazy.
yeah, no, it's dangerous. And I keep thinking that things are going to bottom out, but they haven't yet. But so that maybe makes it think that it's up to us to ensure that they don't bottom out. So I think a challenge for all of us is to think about what is a kind of round table that we could establish in our own life, in our own neighborhood, to make things a little bit better. We mentioned Teresa Mobile earlier. Some of her other work shows the importance of small wins, and I become more and more convinced in terms of change, whether it's change in an organization, change in a society, that small wins is really the way to go. That giant, big, hairy, audacious goals, it can be good sometimes, but the way that things really change is there's a small win, cascades to another small win, cascades to another small win, and that's how things actually get done.
Never really figured out hedgehogs and flywheels and all the rest of
I mean, I think there's some value to that. I think there's some
Well, sure.
value to high aspiration, but I think if you look at the lived experience of most organizations, absent a near-death experience, you see very little change based on big, hairy, audacious goals. You see change based on small wins. You see change based on this kind of almost viral, infective kind of something changes. One person does something, it works. Another person sees it, replicates it. Another person sees it, replicates it, and all of a sudden, it replicates. And to mix metaphors a bit, a leader then gets out in front of that parade that's already started.
And I think that's what's so important about transparency. So in our little community, we have things called Kaizen boards, which are,
Yeah.
quick and easy improvements, and they're very visible, and you make them visible. So one final thing, thank you so much for spending the time with me today and helping our guys understand a lot about what you've been doing, which is quintessentially important to our community. You find yourself optimistic about the world in general, or are you And if
I'm,
so,
I'm generally, it depends on the day.
yeah,
Um,
I feel
I think
kind of agnostic about that too.
Yeah, I think on balance, I am optimistic. I do think that the trajectory of life in America or North America is generally positive. It's imperfect, but generally positive. One thing that was, I think, instructive is that this is now 20 plus years ago. I just ordered on eBay a bunch of books that were futurists looked at the year 2000. Right, so we're coming up on the millennium, and so that seemed like such a far off year long ago, and people were envisioning things, and essentially the way that it's
Is that
sorted
guy
out.
Toffler or somebody?
Oh, Toffler is just one of them. I mean, Herman Kahn. There are a lot of other folks who had done the. Toffler was actually very prescient on a lot of things. But there were other there are various kinds of government commissions and white papers and things like that. And so essentially what you had is you had some, I don't remember the exact proportions, but it's roughly this. You had maybe 55% of people of these projections being sort of outrageously utopian. It's going to be this landscape where no one is ever going to be hungry, where no one is ever going to be unhoused, where everybody can have, sex without consequence all day long and earn gazillions of dollars and da-da-da. So this very utopian thing. And then you have the other side, like maybe 45%, or maybe like 40%, that was like grim, charred landscape. No one's going to have jobs. Every natural resource is going to be exhausted. It's going to be this burnt landscape, this hellscape that is going to be unlivable. And then you had like 10% of people saying, I think it's going to be a little better. And those were the ones who were right. So the crazy utopians were wrong. The crazy dystopians were even more wrong. And the people who said something that was profoundly undramatic and uninteresting, yeah, I think it's going to be a little better. They tended to be right. And that's sort of, I side with the unexciting 10% there. I think it's going to be a little bit better. I think we're going to get there in a herky-jerky way. I think there's going to be a lot of imperfection, but I think in general, especially in the United States, I think in Canada too, the history of our country has been that the future has been better than the past. Imperfectly, slowly, not unreservedly, but in general, we make progress.
On that note, which is a pretty upbeat note.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sensibly upbeat.
Really,
hard-headed optimism.
yeah. So I've really appreciated your books and your work, and keep it up. And
thanks a lot.
Write a book on contracts. Let me know. Maybe we could
All
get
right,
it.
I'll see.
All right.
I'll see if it comes to that. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me, Dick. I enjoyed talking to you.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Have
Bye.
a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to the Lean Construction Blogs podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please help us spread the word by sharing, subscribing, or leaving a review on your preferred podcast listening platform. Remember to join us next time as we continue to lower the barriers to applying lean construction and help take your lean journey to the next level. And don't forget to visit the Lean Construction blog to stay up to date on our latest podcast episodes, weekly blog posts, monthly webinars, and upcoming conferences. We hope to see you on the next episode.